So welcome to the Centre of Excellence Roundtable. These are regular events where we get experts from the industry to have a discussion about what really makes a difference around a Centre of Excellence. And I think what came out from the last discussion was everyone was focusing on the word centre, not the word excellence. So this is all around not where the people sit, but actually what we're trying to do in terms of improving the way that we deliver Salesforce and get the benefits out of it. So this time we thought we'd change tack a little, and instead of talking just to the people who implement Salesforce, we thought we'd talk to some of the people who are the customers. But before we launch into the panel session, I just want to set the scene in terms of about a Centre of Excellence. So a Centre of Excellence, the first question is, what is one and why do I need one? It's really about getting some consistent standards around how you implement Salesforce. So for some of our customers, it's one org. For other customers, it's 30 or 40 different orgs managing multiple business units. So it's all about getting some consistency over the implementation. And that looks like a long laundry list on the left there of the things you need to do. But the point is it's about skills, not necessarily roles. So you don't need 13 different people or 26 people. It's about the roles that are being filled. The second point is it's phased. A lot of these things, if you're a relatively small organization, probably you don't need to do into a great deal of detail. But as you get bigger, clearly some of these things become critically important. And I think the last point, these are solved problems. So you may be coming into the Salesforce ecosystem and going, wow, this is amazing. But we've been doing this for 20, 30 years. And if you look at sort of the hairstyles of some of the people on the call, we've been doing it for longer than that. So these are solved problems. They're not things which are brand new. And some research that came from 10K Advisors shows that those people who have a Centre of Excellence in place get a higher return on investment. It says there that 91% of the respondents from the survey said that if they had a Centre of Excellence in place, they had a very high ROI. So clearly this stuff is important. So therefore, and we're seeing a lot more people talking about it. There are several LinkedIn groups that are now having discussions. Clearly, we're getting a great response for these Centre of Excellence lounges. So this is something which is becoming more important, particularly as Salesforce becomes a more strategic platform inside organizations. So I said that the Centre of Excellence is phased. What this slightly complicated graph is trying to show you that if you're a small implementation, and that small does not necessarily mean not very many people, but it's the level of maturity of your implementation, you can get away with several things. You probably don't need a long-term vision for your for Salesforce on your CoE, but you certainly need a level of leadership. Don't need a massive vision, but the red blobs mean that you do need it in place. You absolutely need some leadership. Governance, yellow dot, you can get away with it. Change control, less important. Standards, not that important. So as you can see, the red dot's really important as you become bigger. Yellow dots, it's medium. White dot, probably not critical. So as you increase the maturity of your implementation, as you increase the complexity and the strategic importance of the implementation, more and more of these things become important. So you don't need to start with this massive great list of things from the Centre of Excellence, but there are some things, even if you're small, you need to have in place. You clearly need to have leadership. You need the support of your executive team. They spend a lot of money on Salesforce, even if you're a relatively small implementation. You definitely need to understand how you configure it, metadata management. You absolutely need to understand architecture, because if you don't build it right, it will come back and bite you in the future. And as I said, as time goes on, as the implementation becomes more important, you can put more and more of these things in place. Let's do some introductions first of all. Carter Wiggle. Carter, again, long-term Salesforce implementation consultant in Cloud Trigger, which then was acquired by Cloud Sherpas. Cloud Sherpas was then acquired by Accenture. My background is Accenture. I think we all end up there at some point. Since then, he had a brief spell at WeWork and now is the co-founder and CEO at Thunder, which is a new consultancy. I think your co-founder, Carter, is Lou Fox. So Lou's one of our advisory board members, great guy, who came out of Blue Wolf. So again, a newish consultancy, but huge levels of expertise in terms of Salesforce implementations. Leading on to Will Anastas, who is the CRO at Conviva. So interesting enough, Will had 6 years at Salesforce, so worked inside Salesforce, but selling Salesforce to customers. Stepped out to then work at Procore, again in sales, and is now the CRO at Conviva. which again, another company where technology meets data. So they're all about market intelligence around streamed media. So if you want to know who watched the most at the Super Bowl, then Conviva absolutely knows. And we were just having a discussion before everyone jumped on that my daughter's now a songwriter and went from virtually no streams to 770,000 streams on TikTok. And I think Will said TikTok are a customer. So all the analysis that she's working on to try and work out why that happened, probably she's using some of the services from Conviva. So with that, let's launch into some of the questions. Again, if people have questions, let's throw them into the chat. But I've got a long list of questions I wanted to go through here. So let's start with you, Will. So Salesforce sets a very high expectation about what Salesforce can deliver, and obviously you were in the heart of Salesforce selling it. So what are the expectations for return on investment? Too high? What are your experiences now you're a user of Salesforce?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think I've got a unique perspective, as does Carter, us being both Salesforce alumni. You know, from our ROI standpoint, when we sold Salesforce, we would always weave a story about, you know, centralizing all this information into one hub, and that would increase, dramatic increases in productivity because everyone would be on the same page for the most part. And I think now that I'm on the other side, trying to justify the investment that we do make in Salesforce, it's a lot more complex than that statement, right? And I think it's evolved over time as well. As you think about Salesforce's evolution, when I first got there, we were just selling the Sales Cloud and Service Cloud, right? And then obviously they opened up the platform with Force.com, and then Marketing Cloud came together. So by the time I left, it was 8 different clouds into the system. The interesting thing is, I mean, Salesforce's greatest attribute is its ability to be customized. It's also its greatest Achilles heel, because if you customize it, if you over-engineer it, if you take something that is a very simple process and put too much customization around it, you end up creating friction and creating sand in the gears. It's very, very difficult to kind of flush out. So, to say that the way I look at my investment in Salesforce and the adjacent tools that plug into Salesforce, because now it's an ecosystem of solutions that create the Salesforce experience, even though I'm purchasing services from other companies to fulfill the promise of what I need to get done and fulfill the processes I need to build. It's now this huge investment of time and effort and money that we put in to maintain and develop these systems. And all I really want as a CRO, right, is a centralized hub of information where I can find anything about any customer at any time, right? So to do that, you need to really think through a strategy on how you're going to accomplish those goals, while at the same time maximizing productivity. Because at the end of the day, CRM tools are productivity enhancers, right? I mean, back in the day when I was selling for, in the 90s with Anheuser-Busch, there was no technology wrapped around this thing. I mean, we were putting sales into some sort of database in St. Louis, and I can only imagine the server farm or the room and air conditioning and the databases that were there to try to process that information. Those days are gone, and those centralized hubs of information really need to be finely tuned in order for you to get the ROI you need to get out of the system.
So it sounds like the sort of the customer 360 vision that's painted at Dreamforce is being delivered, or is it still work in progress, do you think?
Closing the loop with, I think it really depends on who your customer is, right? I think we use the word customer as a kind of an all-encompassing term, right? If you're in a B2B business, you should have a pretty good understanding of who your customer is and what they do, right? That's not really that hard to close that loop. If you're in a B2B2C business, it's much more difficult and complex, because to understand your customer's customer is really the most important thing. And I would actually argue that in the B2B world, you could make that correlation as well. So I think, at the end of the day, it really depends on who your customer is, what type of kind of sales motion you're going for, if it's B2B or B2B2C. There are variables in that.
Will painted quite a great picture of a CRM being used well. Is that your experience as you go from customer to customer?
I think there's always room for improvement with Salesforce. CRM is always changing, and I think that also companies go through kind of massive headwinds throughout the year. So I think every time there's an executive change, or there's a new product release, or there's C19 other transformational changes that are hitting the business, it takes a company off track, right? And so when that happens, it becomes really challenging for them. Their business processes break. They don't necessarily go back and redefine those. And so they start having a lot of issues around adoption with Salesforce. So what we typically find in the market is that most organizations, they just struggle on some of the basics. They still have issues around, collaboration, managing accounts and contacts, forecasting, getting the right reporting and analytics. And so when you think about ROI, there's really some simple and kind of basic things that organizations can do to get substantial ROI quickly with Salesforce. So yeah, I think in general there's still a lot of challenges in the marketplace for sure. That's why we see a lot of opportunity too. And I really liked what Will was commenting on. I think really understanding also for organizations that customer journey map. A lot of organizations don't have a customer journey map, and the challenge is when you're in an organization at any size, whether you're a small company, a medium-sized company, or a large company, there's so many different dependencies that happen across the business, and this is where really like a CRO, or even more so a CEO that has control over the different business units and can make decisions when things go from the marketing team to the sales team to the customer success team, the customer support team. When those decisions can't be made, it dramatically challenges the business to the sense that they can't get basic reports and analytics because you're breaking things throughout that cycle. So yeah, a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, and I think the last year, God, it's nearly a year, isn't it, since we all got sent home to stare at screens. But it's digital transformation has accelerated over the last 5-6 months. I think that's put enormous strain on organizations. But the positive side is it's given a lot of organizations to say we're rethinking some of the business models. If we're having to rethink that, let's make sure we rethink it and try and simplify it. I think to the point that Will made about it's very easy to customize the hell out of Salesforce. We've started collecting sort of implementation horror stories, and a lot of those are driven around poor architecture and a poor documentation of what's been built, and therefore the configuration is so out of control it's almost impossible to unpick some of that. So I think one of the things I'm hearing sort of both from you, Carter, and from you, Will, is so not back to basics, but try and keep things simple and keep it understood. Because again, if it's simpler to understand, it's simpler to change. And I think the key thing that's happening now is having to change relatively quickly. So back to, I think, Will, your situation, the Super Bowl was no longer lots of people sitting in seats. It was a lot more people streaming. So that must have put some different challenges around the sort of data that you're trying to capture.
Yeah, I mean, it does. And in our industries, particularly in streaming, it's really been the tale of two entities, right? You've got, streaming because everyone was trapped in their house. And you've also got the dynamics of linear TV and streaming video, and generationally how that's shifted. I mean, my kids will never have a cable TV subscription in their lives. It's not how they consume entertainment anymore. But yeah, I mean, the pandemic has certainly helped our business in a lot of ways in terms of just a lot of people watching streaming content. But at the same time, you had sports. A lot of our customers are sports publishers, and they got decimated when sports shut down, right? So you really have this interesting dynamic. But in terms of the data we collect, sure, I mean, the spikes in volumes make it very difficult to manage all that data and then create insights from that data, which is really what our tools do. But it's not, that's not dissimilar for the challenges we've had on the business side as well. Running a business in the middle of a pandemic has certainly put more pressure on making sure that you can get the information out of systems instead of getting information by bumping into Carter at the water cooling and having a 5-minute chat,
Sure.
Right? That piece is gone now. And, we've entered into this world, which is very kind of meeting focused. and output focused without the benefit of human interaction with one another. And it's a very, very strange paradigm. And I know there's a lot of talk in the market right now about what the future of work will look like. Salesforce, I think, just indicated last week that they're going to have a very different working policy with 3 different types of employees, right? How long that lasts, if that's a trend that continues over the next 10 years, that's still up for debate. I still firmly believe that human beings just desire human contact with one another. And I think our natural instincts will bring us all together at some point once we get past this, once people feel super comfortable. But it does provide opportunities to make sure that the systems that you have in place, they're the connective tissue you have with your employees, right? And that information just needs to be accurate and easily accessible, which I think puts more pressure on Salesforce administrators and also people thinking through strategies. How do we actually do that, knowing that this is really one of the only pieces of connective tissue that our employees have with each other?
So again, it's an interesting point. So Carter, are you hearing that from your customers, or are they still just still banging rocks together, trying to make Salesforce work? Are they thinking as strategically as like we just heard from Will?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously the customers are kind of forced to make change, right? One of the biggest challenges that I see with a lot of organizations out there is coming back to some of the fundamentals. So a lot of organizations, they don't have a clear roadmap or prioritization. So you were showing a slide earlier when you kicked off the meeting that talked about kind of the vision and the roadmap. I would say that organizations, they don't do a good job of thinking about CRM over the next 12 months. And what is that roadmap? What is the prioritization? And what are the resources to get there? So it's amazing sometimes when we can just get a group of people in a room and we can, start using conversation to get them to a place to understand what those goals and objectives are. But I think a lot of it comes back to executing on the basics. And it just, again, kind of a lack of organizational structure around Salesforce.
So, okay, when you start thinking about vision, Will, do you feel you're part of that product management team? Are you setting the roadmap, or is it the IT team? Who's setting that roadmap in that direction?
In terms of CRM, Ian?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's collaborative for sure. It's a combination of IT, sales operations. In my case, I've got a really great sales operation team that is, we've got a few admins on our staff so we can make changes on the fly. But strategically, it's sitting down with those folks and making sure we can figure out exactly what we want to get out of the system. There's an interesting trend going on in sales right now where we've got this proliferation of tools that can connect into Salesforce that provide bits and pieces of really what I see as the ultimate kind of 360 view of your customer, and relying on understanding not only, like for instance, outreach. Like outreach gives you a great tool set that gives you the ability to create sequences and do prospecting in that way. All that information is now collected into Salesforce. And then you have Gong coming on top of it, so you can record the conversations, right? Then you've got, we use Aviso from a forecasting standpoint to run analytics and AI analysis on the pipeline, and then I've got Zoom information to go hydrate the data, right? All of that is like this mash of stuff. And really what I'm trying to get, one thing Aviso does that's really cool too, is they have a feature where you can actually record the conversations you have with your team as you're doing pipeline and forecast calls. So for me, I'm thinking this 360-degree view of the conversation that my team is having with our customers is super powerful. We've never had those type of recordings prior to, the past 3 or 4 years, really. So it's such an amazing time to be in sales because that whole loop of the conversation can now be closed, right? You have all the interactions between the sales team and the customer. You have all the internal interactions, right? If you use Slack as a way with the plugins and all that stuff, you can kind of assemble all of this information. So for someone like me who's trying to figure out if that deal is going to close or not, so I can be super accurate with forecasting, I have a treasure trove of data now to go through, right? Whereas before, I think our profession was very much gut feel.
Yeah.
So the question is how do you take all of that stuff, all of that goodness, and stitch it together for in a long-term strategy in an ever-changing environment that we're living in. It's a really difficult task. And I can't say that we've mastered it. I'm far from it, right? I mean, I think we're learning every single day. How do we maximize the productivity out of these tools in the system to benefit the sales team so they can go faster? But it's still an amazing challenge if you think through, like 12 months from now, what is it going to look like? It's hard to predict that.
But it sounded like you listed off the acquisition targets for Salesforce there. I mean, joking aside, it makes it hard where you've got to stitch together all these different technologies. I mean,
that's right. And I think that's probably the fundamental challenge that a lot of us have in these roles. Like, we get peppered constantly. I mean, my LinkedIn inbox is just flooded with BDRs trying to sell me something, right? Which, by the way, I'm not a huge fan of. But
oddly enough.
Yeah, but regardless of that, I mean, you still have to figure out, all of these tools have specific benefits that kind of round out that loop, right? I think there are companies out there that are working on trying to close that entire loop as one solution. But it's a very interesting dynamic period in sales, because now I have all that data. What do I do with it? How do I action that intelligence? How do I quickly discern the things in there that are that will be helpful for me in terms of making a decision about that particular opportunity, or even understanding the strategy around that particular opportunity? So yeah, I mean, the fundamental issue is, how do you glue it together? And if you don't have a strategy on how you glue that together, it's just going to be a pile of stuff with different inputs going in different directions.
And again, Carter, I mean, that sometimes that's a role for you as the consultant. You're the stranger with the briefcase. Although we know, obviously, we know, so that's a very Accenture term, isn't it? I mean, that's when we used to turn up to clients and be the stranger with a briefcase. Now it's the face on the screen. But sometimes you're setting the vision for customers if they don't have it. Do you think that's the case, or do you think most customers have got a vision?
A vision around CRM, or more stitching together all these different apps?
I think if the vision is CRM, that's not a vision. The vision needs to be broader than that. It's about. Yeah. If we're worried about the applications, we've got a problem. We need to be worrying about what Will's talking about, which is, how do I actually get productivity out of my sales teams? Right.
Yeah, I mean, on the broader vision, I mean, one of the typical questions that I'll ask an organization is, do they have a clear and documented Salesforce vision plan? And a high percentage of the time, I kind of get mixed answers around that. And the reality is, most of the time, the answer is no. And then the follow-on question is, to that, typically, if they do have one, is your management team fully on board with that plan? And the other reality of that is, it's almost never a yes around that, because, again, going back to some of the comments earlier, if you just put a head of marketing in one room and you ask them what their top priorities are for the next quarter, and you go into a separate room with the head of sales and ask what their top priorities are for that quarter, you go in a separate room and you talk to the head of customer success, almost 90% of the time, you're not going to get aligned priorities. So this, I think, coming back to the question, it's really organizations that are, to the topic of this, I think meeting today, is driving towards really either a center of excellence or just having some very basic rules of engagement. Because just like anything, whether organizations today are using V2 moms or they're using OKRs, I mean, you have to constantly meet. You should be meeting every single week, right? If you're meeting quarterly against those, it's too late, because the business has already changed. So,
yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting. That suggests the idea of, oh, we're not ready for a center of excellence, we need to be a lot bigger. The answer is, you will never get bigger unless you actually have some of the basics of the center of excellence in place, whether it's the strategy, the leadership of that direction. I think it's a topic for a different discussion, but I think the term Salesforce administrator is massively demeaning. So we were a Salesforce customer 20 years ago, and it was an administrator. You added users and you did a few things. Now it's a Salesforce product owner. Mm-hmm. We need to elevate the conversation to say, you're not an administrator who adds fields or adds new functionality, but you need someone in the organization needs to be the product manager of Salesforce, the product manager for the sales system, because then they can do what Will needs, which is stitching together the applications and thinking about how this hangs together. And if they're not going to do it, then you need to bring a consultancy in to do it, to give you that oversight and go, let me show you what the future looks like.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are still just along with some of the other areas that I've highlighted, some of the challenges that we see. The other is just, what is your staffing plan, right, for the next 12 months? And I have to chuckle a little bit when I see some of these companies, they post that they want a Salesforce administrator, and the Salesforce administrator admin needs to know Einstein, they need to know how to do development and coding, and it's so far out of what I would think of your traditional role for Salesforce administrator, right? But definitely to your point, Ian, I think that Salesforce administrators should be part of the strategic group who's meeting regularly to make sure that they're capturing user feedback. The users have a voice, the salespeople, et cetera, through this kind of ongoing, need to support Salesforce. So I think, part of the challenge is, again, is lack of clarity around the roles and the definition. But a lot of companies that we work with today, big, enterprise companies all the way down to mid-sized companies. There's a company that we're working with right now. They have about 700 employees, roughly. They have a team of about 40 people internally at their company that help manage Salesforce, ranging from very senior program leaders to technical architects, all the way down through developers to multiple Salesforce admins. So even through that, they're still looking for help and support from us to help augment those resources. So looking at your staffing plan and thinking about not just the next 3 months, but the next 12 months, what do you need to be successful?
Mm-hmm. And it's also, and part of it is in 3 months' time, the business may well be different. So it's actually being, I think the other thing about we talked about with the Center of Excellence is it's having the tools in place to go, we can't move quickly unless we understand where we are. I think the very beginning of the conversation, you talked about having a well-documented sales process, well-understood metrics. Very difficult to move and evolve if you don't understand where you currently are.
I mean, I think every single executive that I talk to, definitely in the business side, and certainly anywhere that revenue is touching that person's responsibility, it's always go faster, right? Mm-hmm. They always want to go faster, but sometimes they just don't have, again, that clear roadmap and prioritization, and then the resources to do that.
But let's go back to where we started with Will as well, where you said Salesforce is easy to customize, but actually the downside is it's easy to customize. Mm-hmm. And we talked to lots of customers who said, I think the best strategy is throw it away and start again.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases,
in Salesforce and throw it away and start again cannot be the right answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it might be where you've got to, but surely that can't be the most cost-effective approach. From a business perspective, it's so disruptive on the business side.
Yeah, I mean, that would be, you're giving me the chills right now, just thinking if I had to blow up my Salesforce system and start over again, that's a massive project, right? And even when I was at Salesforce selling, you could see customers heading down this pathway of doom, where they just continually over-engineer their processes into the system, right? My approach has always been simple, like understand what you need to get out of the system, build a system to accomplish that, and don't overcomplicate it. I think a lot of times when you get into IT departments in particular, there's a thirst and a desire to get in there and really show what they can do, right? And next thing you know, you've got an over-engineered Mercedes-Benz when you just needed a Chevy, right? And from where I sit, I don't, and again, I think the challenge for us is that when you over-engineer processes, you actually add more complexity, right? Which defeats the purpose of speed.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's where you need, when you create these kind of committees or these COEs, you need to have people from the business side come in and really understand what they want to get out of it and transfer that information to the IT and the technical people who are actually doing the knob turning, and make sure that they understand that to resist that urge to over-engineer it, right? And here are the downsides to the business if you were to do that. But I've seen systems out there that are just completely, they're so far down the pathway of doom that they really need a lot of help to extract themselves from it. And a lot of help means a lot of money. And a lot of money, when that project's going underway, the sales team is somewhat crippled in this period of trying to rotate into a more simpler process. So it's something that I think out of the gate needs to be thought of at a very, very strategic high level, or else you can find yourself in trouble fast.
I mean, clearly that's part of Element's role is we're starting to unpick or tell people what's inside the org so you can start to unpick it rather than throw it away. But I mean, so just Will, you joined what, Conviva a year and a bit ago? So
Yeah, yeah, it's been about a year and change. Yep.
there you go. So
Blast in COVID, by the way. It's great to start a job, spend 2 months in the office, and then find yourself in your basement for the rest of the time.
yeah, well, so in the interview, where do you see yourself in the next 2 years? Well, like, not in my basement was probably the answer.
That's number one. Yeah, hopefully on an airplane. In front of the
Yeah,
customer.
quite.
Yeah.
But you must have walked into a brand, essentially, like Carter does every day, walked into a new Salesforce implementation or an implementation that's brand new. So, what were the first things you did when you first got there?
The first thing I did was try to understand what I had, right? Just get a grounding of exactly what's coming out of the system, and then identifying those holes. I think anyone who walks in, CROs have a lifespan of about 18 months on average, right? So by the time I got there, there were a couple CROs before me who had their own desires to get inputs get outputs out of the system, right? So it's building upon what they had established, but also understanding that, and this is just a fault of mine. I'm an incredibly data-driven CRO, meaning I thirst for data, and I also appreciate what it takes to build and create these systems, having come from that environment at Salesforce. So for me, it was just understanding what I had, and then strategically looking out at the business and saying, what don't I have, in order for me to make well-informed decisions. Okay. And then that led us back on this journey where we've created this complete sets of data that we're harvesting out of Salesforce that will be the unit of measure for the business moving forward. We've actually jammed it into this little binder. It's not a binder, it's electronic now, but it's actually all based on Tableau. But it's essentially the captain's log is what we call it, to kind of take take something from Star Trek, right? But this captain's log contains all sorts of data outputs in terms of every single element that we want to measure the business on. And it's essentially pulling data that is predictive, so pipeline, thinking about the future, historical, what we've done in the past, and then current state, where we are today. Now, to get that to happen with all the disparate systems that are capturing that data, right, was really the fundamental challenge that we set our team off on. And, they've done a pretty amazing job cobbling it together, but I will say it was not an overnight experience either. It's something that had to happen over time. And, in fact, we just launched the captain's log last month, right? So it's been a year in the baking, but we finally got there, and I'm very confident that we have a really great baseline of information extracted out of Salesforce through these apps coming our way that will help us make well-informed decisions and help us run the business in a much more data-driven way instead of a gut feel way.
So that captain's log sounds like, if I go back to what the whole principle of this discussion, which is the center of excellence, some of the things that you've been talking about would be elements that would go into your center of excellence. What's the vision? What are the standards? Like,
Yep.
the standards of what standards doesn't mean just naming standards. It means what are the key metrics we need? What are those metrics called? Okay, so your captain's log is a key document as part of that direction. So I'm sure, Carter's now it's like, I'm more than happy to walk into your organization and help you improve because you've done all the hard work. So, again, how much, Carter, when you walk into an organization, what are you looking for when you first walk into that new org?
Yeah, we tend to think about the Salesforce ecosystem, and what I would say Salesforce like health checks kind of across the board is we really see it across three main pillars. One is the business adoption. So this is making sure that there's the right business alignment, user experience, and also user alignment overall. And then the second is the technical solution. And then the third is program excellence. So again, business adoption, technical solution, and program excellence. So within each of those three spheres, we can get in there and very quickly understand where there might be issues and challenges. So for example, a lot of times we get brought into organization, they might say, hey, we're having a lot of issues and challenges with data dedupe or data enrichment. And what we typically often find is, again, it might come back to lack of business alignment. So we run optimizations very efficiently to come back in and help these organizations and kind of, read out and score their Salesforce environment so we can help them actually to start getting some quick wins and addressing some of those issues and challenges that we identify across those three different spheres.
So you talked about some alignment or some way of scoring Salesforce. Again, I've not heard of anything in the ecosystem that says, okay, you've X companies are all in the technology sector. This is what good looks like.
Yeah.
Is there anything, or am I missing something?
No, you're right. I mean, I think there's a number for good is different for each organization, right? So I would love to come out to the market and, coin something that your Salesforce score should be X in, yeah, wouldn't that be great? But I think for a lot of organizations, it's just, ensuring across some of the different key areas, do they have the right platform health? Are they getting the right data value, right? Will was talking a lot about that. So do they have the right solution architecture? So there's a number of areas that, can help organizations, again, what I would say, identify where you are today. What are the gaps to get there over time?
So let's bring this full circle, because I'm conscious of time. We start this by talking about return on investment. So the aim has to be that the business is happy to write a check to Salesforce every year. It's not something you have to do. It's something you're happy to do because actually it's a positive return on investment. What are some of the measures that you would, and I'll think about, Carter, from some of your customers, how that works, and from Will, from your perspective, what are the measures that you would use to say, okay, this, we are happy to write the check to Salesforce, it's giving us the benefits we need? How would you measure that?
Yeah, and let me just make a comment, because I think I'll try not to go off on too big of a tangent here, but I think unfortunately the way that Salesforce came to market, or fortunately I should say, because I'm very thankful that Salesforce is in the market. Cloud computing was new, right? And so this whole concept of, you can flip a switch and be up and running with Salesforce immediately. There's great value in that proposition. But I think, over the years, a lot of organizations, they have this mindset that Salesforce should be easy to use, which it should be, right? That's the goal, that's the utopia. But the bigger reality is that there's a massive investment that needs to go in with CRM, right? So you need to obviously have the internal team, the resources. Did I lose you guys?
No, we're here.
Okay, sorry, I thought my Zoom here froze, and so I think there's just a unfortunately, education, in the market about the true investment that it takes with Salesforce. And I'll go to like kind of an extreme level here, right? In our world, in the consulting world, I think a lot about, companies and organizations, the Fortune 1000 companies, right? And so in the Fortune 1000 companies, all these Fortune 1000 companies, they work with the GSIs, so the Accentures, the Deloittes, the KPMGs, et cetera. They could 100% afford to go out and build those internal teams themselves, but they don't, because they get a ton of value by working with third-party organizations to help them achieve their goals. So I think, the ROI around Salesforce, typically there's a number of ways that you can manage it. And I think Will and I, back in the day, we were probably creating some of those calculators, but I'll go back to, I think it's, for a lot of organizations, it can be very simple, right? It's looking at things like the amount of hours saved if you were actually able to improve things like, contact cleanup or activity recording. And so you can, make some broad assumptions based on your users and the number of minutes saved or hours saved in a day. You can multiply that by the amount of people on your team, and you'll start actually getting some clear ROI around some fundamental things. So I think it's important, though, to make the ROI black and white and very measurable versus some very lofty goals, which there's a number of different models that can be very successful to help you get to that clear ROI. But to your point, Ian, I would say very few organizations that I am working with today, a lot of people don't use ROIs anymore. They don't really necessarily believe in the ROI. They don't believe in the TCO, which I think personally is a mistake. I'm still a big fan of them. You've got to have some metrics, kind of KPIs that you're driving towards, and make them measurable.
Will, picking up on a couple of Carter's point, his comment about investment, it's taken you a year to get the captain's log together. So the first question is like, why is it taking you so long? It can't be that hard. I've watched the videos. It's this stuff you can implement in a few days. I'm being flippant here. Clearly, there is a huge level of investment to align the teams to get that stuff together. So Carter came out with his view about ROI. I think when you first started talking, you were talking more about, can you make the right decisions? So that sounds like a different way of measuring the ROI.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Carter's points are extremely valid, right? I mean, if you think about the human capacity that can be saved by implementing a proper CRM system, sure, you're going to get tons of efficiencies, right? And I think that those are certainly measurable, and they're direct line impact to having a proper CRM, right? Back to the captain's log story. I mean, the reason why it took us so long was because we over-engineered it, right? And also you have, I think, a lot of people, you have different leaders who come in who expect different things out of a CRM also. So you have a different strategic vision. So walking into a scenario that has that kind of history behind it, there's some scar tissue left in the system from that. And you need to remove the scar tissue and get your data ducks in a row in order to get the outputs, right? Because at the end of the day, especially with the proliferation of the apps around Salesforce, Salesforce's data has to be the most clean, pristine, like Lake Tahoe blue, beautiful data in order to feed and enrich all the other apps that you need to use these functions. If that data is not clean and neat, it has a knock-on impact to all the other pieces. And that does, in fact, depress ROI, if you think about it, right? So, for me, I think one of the questions you had asked earlier, writing that check to Salesforce, it's a painful check to write, right? And then if you start thinking about the apps that plug into Salesforce, adding those checks also, these are painful checks to write, unless you're directly getting the data you need to make decisions, at least from my point of view. And there's other ways to measure it for sure, right? But if you're using your CRM properly, it should be the main driver for all the information you need to make smart business decisions. And that's a fundamental shift from getting out of, well, if you implement Salesforce, you can get rid of these people because they're now redundant because it's all automated. Yeah, that's going to happen too, right? But the value of the C-suite is getting data to make smart business decisions so that we can look our employees in the eye and say, we made the best decision we could have with the best available data we had at that moment in time. Now, time will tell whether that was a good decision or not. And I've made a lot of really bad ones in my career, but I can always look back at the moment and say it was based on the data that I had at the moment in time, and it was the best decision I could have made with that said data. But setting yourself up for that is, I think, what's critical.
I don't think we could have a better way of finishing that discussion than that summarized view of the power of CRM, making sure you make the best decisions in the moment based on the available data. So again, thank you guys for joining us. There'll be a recording of this sent out to everyone who's attended. And again, thank you for spending the time with us. It's been absolutely fascinating. This conversation, we could go on all day.